Howdy. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program this evening. I'm David Jones with the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation, and we're delighted to have all of you here. Would you join me in welcoming the 41st President of the United States and Mrs. Bush? President and Mrs. Bush, we're so honored to be with you. Wonderful to have you here. And tonight we couldn't be more pleased to present this very special installment of the ConocoPhillips White House Lecture Series, which is under the leadership of the Bush School and the Mosbacher Institute. And before we get into our program, just a couple of announcements and a couple of housekeeping points. First, I want to welcome some special guests who are with us tonight. And as a way of introducing the first guest, I'm going to show you a couple of slides here you might recognize. So that, of course, is the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier. And we are so pleased to have with us tonight from the United States Navy, Rear Admiral Brian Luther, who is preparing to step aside as the commander of the Navy's Carrier Strike Group 2, which includes USS George H.W. Bush, Rear Admiral Ken Weitzel, who is preparing to take the reins of Carrier Strike Group 2, Captain Will Pennington, who is the captain of the aircraft carrier, and Captain Jim McCall, who runs Carrier Wing 8. Gentlemen, would you please stand so we can welcome you? Wonderful to have you with us. This distinguished group was here to brief President Bush this afternoon about the Bush Carrier Group, which will soon be redeployed overseas under their motto, Freedom at Work. And again, it may not be Veterans Day, may have been last week, but we sure salute you for your service. Thank you again for being with us. Now, the crew of the aircraft carrier numbers 4,700 men and women. And each year, 4 sailors are selected as Sailors of the Year. And one of the benefits of the selection is visiting and touring our presidential library. So they were here this weekend and also got to attend the A&M football game where they greeted President Bush. Have evidence of that. And they were also saluted on the field during the game. Turned out to be one of the more favorable highlights of the game, but that's another story. Sorry. We have visitors from the great state of Ohio with us tonight. I almost said the red state of Ohio. That almost slipped out. We want to welcome Speaker Cliff Rosenberger. Cliff, I know you're out there. If you'll stand. Oh, Cliff, you missed your seat up here. Cliff served in the George W. Bush White House and then in the Interior Department before moving back to Ohio and running for the House in Ohio, and was elected Speaker after 2 years. He's also with tonight Representative Nathan Manning, also in the Ohio legislature. If you'll stand. Thank you. And we welcome Joey Harrington with us tonight with ConocoPhillips, representing the company. We are so grateful to ConocoPhillips for all that they have done and the tremendous long-standing support of this lecture series and so many other programs over the years. Joey came all the way from Washington to be with us tonight. Welcome. Also want to welcome my colleague Tyson Vocal, who's out here, who's president of the A&M Foundation. Tyson, take a bow. Thank you. And also my partners here at the Bush Center, Dean Mark Welsh, who's here, with his wife Betty. And the director of our Presidential Library, Warren Finch, right here. Now, I know you saw the coming attractions on the slides as you were waiting for our program to begin, but I want to just call your attention to a couple of events that are coming up. The first is on December 1st at 5:30. Warren and his team will be hosting the Library and Archives annual Christmas tree lighting ceremony, which will take place, of course, outside, and then a reception inside. And that's sure to put you in the holiday spirit. And of course, holiday spirit wouldn't be complete without some shopping, so our museum store will be open for you. And you might want to check out the Christmas tree ornament for the year. Then on December 7th, the Bush Center will host what we believe will be a very powerful commemoration of the Pearl Harbor attacks, 75 years to the day. That special day will include a brunch, an outdoor ceremony with a flyover of vintage World War II aircraft, a panel right here in the auditorium moderated by Britt Hume and featuring historians James Bradley and John Meacham. And of course, we'll also on that day open a special exhibit over in the library on Pearl Harbor and the impact that it had on 9 different presidents who either served in World War II or were otherwise impacted by Pearl Harbor. And most importantly on that day, we're going to honor our World War II veterans who will be represented by President Bush and Senator Bob Dole. So we hope you'll join us on that day. Now tonight, we know that you'll have some questions for the remarkably great panel that we've got tonight. So we encourage you to write out your questions on the cards that you should have received when you came in. If you don't have them, raise your hand. Our Bush School ambassadors will be circulating and picking up the cards from you, and then we'll pass them to the panel at the end of the panel discussion. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Lauren Wright, and then following Lauren's presentation, Dr. Lori Taylor, who's with us, who teaches economics in the Bush School and is also the director of the Mosbacher Institute, will introduce our panel members. And so on to the main event. We're so pleased to have noted researcher and new author, Lauren Wright, here to discuss her very compelling book entitled On Behalf of the President, Presidential Spouses and White House Communications Strategy. Lauren received her PhD from Georgetown University with a major in American politics and political methodology. She serves on the White House Transition Project Board, which is a nonpartisan group of scholars, journalists, and policy experts whose combined efforts and knowledge aims to ensure a smooth transition in the presidency every 4 years. Her work is coming up. And in her corporate life, Lauren serves as the Director of Investor Relations for NV5 Global, a publicly traded engineering and environmental services corporation. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Lauren Wright.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to President and Mrs. Bush and everybody at the Bush Library. I'm so honored to be here tonight to be able to share some of the results from my research with you. White House and presidential campaign staff, historians, and journalists, and we have some of the most esteemed among them with us here tonight, and you'll get to hear them on the panel, have long attested to the influence of First Ladies in the United States in American politics, even though they lack institutional power and formal responsibilities. But despite this, and because of it, some scholars have shied away from the topic. Political scientists have realized that First Ladies are powerful, but because they're not elected or appointed officials, they have largely dismissed the study of them as a legitimate research topic. Even though political science offers some of the best tools we have for identifying, explaining, and measuring the impact of First Ladies in American politics. I've actually witnessed some hesitance in the academy to treat First Ladies as a serious empirical research topic. In fact, in graduate school, I had trouble finding committee members to sit with me and approve my dissertation topic because they thought studying First Ladies, especially for someone like me who focuses on quantitative methodology, would tarnish my academic reputation. I actually had one person tell me that my topic had mass appeal, but it took me a while to find out that is not a compliment in academia. So I did find advisors eventually, really supportive people, and what I realized through my research is that the mass appeal of First Ladies, how these scholars put it, is precisely one of the reasons they are the single most effective surrogates on the campaign trail in the White House and some of the most relied upon surrogates. This picture of Michelle Obama and President Obama in Iowa in 2012 held the record for a long time as the most liked picture in Facebook in history, and it was also the most retweeted picture at that time. Michelle Obama's 2012 Democratic National Convention speech was viewed online more than 1 million times more than President Clinton's speech that year, 8 times more than President Obama's formal acceptance speech that year, and more times than the entire RNC speaking lineup combined. This year at the conventions, the story was not all that different. These are Twitter statistics that were published by Nielsen, and we can see that again, Michelle Obama's speech prompted the most public engagement with 30,400 tweets per minute generated while she was speaking. She's followed, of course, by President Obama, both nominees, and of course a host of high-profile surrogates, including both of the spouses of the nominees. But missing conspicuously from this list, you'll notice, are a few speeches that were so highly anticipated. Tim Kaine's speech, Mike Pence's speech, and the speeches of Trump's children. So we can start to see that spouses have a particular appeal, and people are particularly interested in the spouse of the president or candidate, not simply family members or top surrogates. Now, one of the ways spouses generate this mass appeal is by appearing on alternative media platforms, and platforms like late-night TV, for example. You may have seen Michelle Obama's appearance on James Corden's show. It was quite good if you haven't. But this clip has been viewed almost 50 million times on YouTube. And just to give you a bit of a contrast, President Obama's 2016 State of the Union address, the single most important speech presidents give each year, received 31 million viewers. That's how many people watched it. Now, what happens in these alternative media settings is First Ladies are offered an opportunity to go around the White House press room rotation. They can get high numbers of viewers. They can get more positive coverage. And, of course, they can attempt to control the narrative. And, Jimmy Fallon will not likely ask Mrs. Obama a tough question, but he will allow her to speak mostly about what she wants, and most of that is her public advocacy work. Now, through a thorough analysis of every publicly documented speech made by a First Lady since 1992, I actually found that First Ladies in most years have given more public speeches than vice presidents. And it appears from these data, which are taken from the White House briefing room websites, that First Ladies are becoming increasingly more active in public over time. meaning Laura Bush may have given more speeches than Hillary Clinton, according to this data, and Michelle Obama has surpassed both of her predecessors with the sheer volume of her public activity. Now, the nature of speeches that First Ladies give has also changed over time. We've seen a reduction in policy speeches. Hillary Clinton, about 8% of her remarks were explicitly policy-related. 15% of Laura Bush's remarks were, and 4% of Michelle Obama's were. But the types of speeches that have increased are speeches about First Lady's own initiatives and interests and campaign activity. Almost 24% of Laura Bush's campaign speeches, during the entire administration were campaign speeches. And almost 30% of all of Michelle Obama's speeches so far in the Obama administration have been campaign speeches. Now, historically, researchers have sought to categorize First Ladies into types, such as modern and traditional spouses. And these terms are meant to signify how involved spouses are in promoting White House policy. But what I find from the numbers, despite First Lady's personal political ideology, professional aspirations, all First Ladies help move the agenda that the president sets in place forward. And one of the best ways they can do this is through their own initiatives. First Ladies have an unbelievable way of depoliticizing a controversial issue. Mrs. Bush, who we're so privileged to have with us here tonight, visited military bases abroad and at home and eased public anxiety about the Gulf War. Laura Bush, some years later, launched her Ready to Read, Ready to Learn initiative, and my research actually shows that prompted greater public support for No Child Left Behind. And Michelle Obama's Let's Move initiative, her signature project, has reinforced public perceptions of the Affordable Care Act as a holistic approach to health care, which prioritizes preventative care and includes measures for preventative care. And it's allowed them an opportunity to acknowledge the high cost of obesity-related disease. Now, another reason First Ladies are so popular is they are perceived to be political outsiders, but as you can see, these popularity ratings are quite impressive. First Ladies have higher favorability than presidents and vice presidents in most year we've measured it. And what's really interesting about this is First Lady's favorability does not track with presidential favorability, like vice presidential favorability does. In 80 of the years Gallup has conducted its Most Admired Man and Woman in the World survey, First Ladies have topped that list since 1948. First Ladies also have higher name recognition than vice presidents, and anyone who's engaged in the business of public persuasion knows that if no one knows who you are and is not paying attention to you, it's very unlikely that you will change minds. And lastly, and this is what I think is the most impressive, people's partisanship does not heavily predict their views toward First Lady like it does towards presidents. So what this graph shows is dots that represent the size of the relationship between party ID and your feelings toward the president or First Lady. So you can see that in most years with the black dots, presidential favorability is much more powerfully predicted than First Lady favorability, and in several of these years, these differences are quite stark. So far, we've talked about First Lady's ability to influence public perceptions of controversial policy through their own initiatives, but we've also talked about their ability to buttress the reputation and public image of presidents themselves. These are some of the reasons that allow them to do that. I want to take you through a couple of survey experiments that actually allow us to test the impact of First Ladies or spouses appearing on the campaign trail beside their spouse or alone. And these particular experiments pertain to Bill Clinton's effectiveness on the campaign trail and Melania Trump's. In one version of this experiment, I showed respondents this picture of President and President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton together, and it was randomly assigned, this treatment. The other group, also randomly assigned, looked at the same picture with Bill Clinton cropped out. And then both groups answered the same battery of questions about whether they supported Secretary Clinton for president and how they felt about her. And here are some of the results. Bill Clinton appears to be able to move opinion on Hillary Clinton in a few areas related to presidential character, which is actually what we find for most first ladies too. Whether the president cares about people like me or the candidate. Is the candidate honest? Are they down to earth? And these results are strongest among Republican men. One of the things I noticed in my research over and over again is the ability of spouses of candidates and presidents to move opinion among the out party and independents, not just opinion within their own. Now, there's another version of this experiment with Melania Trump. I randomly assigned one group to see this picture. It was accompanied by a really generic campaign appeal this time. It said something along the lines of, Donald Trump has great leadership capabilities. Another group was randomly assigned to see a very similar picture of Governor Christie with the same exact campaign appeal attributed to him. And then a final group saw this picture of Donald Trump, and the campaign appeal was attributed to him. He was talking about his own leadership capabilities in this situation. And this is what we see. Mrs. Trump appeals to independents in particular, and she was able to move a support of Donald Trump, which I think is one of the most impressive results of this, opinion of Donald Trump as evidenced by this feeling thermometer measure, and again, these character questions. Is Donald Trump honest, and does he care about people like me? Melania Trump will enter the office of the First Lady with many of the same capabilities and circumstances that made her predecessors such effective messengers. But like them, she alone will choose whether she wants to leverage those resources as well as her unique talents to aid the administration and push their policy agenda forward. Throughout history, First Ladies have been central to White House and campaign communications operations. But we've only just started to systematically study the effect of these efforts. If these results are any indication, then the scholarly community has severely underestimated their political power. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very, very much.
Howdy. It's wonderful to hear somebody applauding for an academic in this lovely setting and to hear such impressive scholarship. I'd now like to invite to the stage three more panelists to involve in our conversation. The first is Ann Compton, who was the first woman assigned to cover the White House on network television and spent 41 years on the air for ABC News. After retiring from daily coverage in 2014, she reignited her legendary career by returning to ABC to cover the 2016 political conventions. She currently serves as a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, focusing on media coverage of the 2016 election. She'll be moderating our discussion this evening. One of our panelists will be Anita McBride. Anita McBride has been in public service for more than 30 years and has served in such varied roles as White House advisor, diplomacy advisor, and human rights advocate. She served as an assistant to President George W. Bush, as well as chief of staff to First Lady Laura Bush. Currently, McBride is executive in residence at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies in the School of Public Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C., and serves as a consultant to HBO's Emmy Award-winning series, Veep. Our fourth panelist is Lissa Muscatine, who has had a distinguished career in journalism, politics, and government. During the Clinton administration, she served as a presidential speechwriter, chief speechwriter to the First Lady, and later as Director of Communications to the First Lady and Deputy Assistant to the President. She most recently served in the Obama administration as Director of Speechwriting and a senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She's co-owner of Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C., and served as an unofficial advisor to Secretary Clinton during the 2016 presidential campaign. Please join me in welcoming these wonderful people to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Let's talk about power. This isn't constitutional power, it's not elected power, but the power of the voice of a First Lady, clearly from Lauren's data, shows what we all kind of knew. First Ladies matter, but we're going to try to now put some personal color into this picture from women who have worked alongside and with First Ladies, and I've covered a few, 7 of them. But it strikes me, Lissa, you and I spoke earlier today about, you were with Hillary Clinton in the early part of her career and the State Department part of her career. Talk about the perception of First Ladies. What do Americans expect, and does that drive what we see and what we accept from First Ladies?
You know, that's a great question, Ann. And first of all, it's just such an honor, President and Mrs. Bush, to be here and to visit your library today and to be part of this panel. So thank you for having me. You know, it's a great question because this is a job, and many people forget this, that has no portfolio. There is no actual job description for First Lady. And yet we project as Americans what we want our First Lady to be, what we want them to look like, how we want them to behave, what role we want them to play. But in fact, they have to really define it for themselves in the context of their own lives, their own interests, their spouse's agenda, and perhaps also the politics of the moment. And I think it's a big pressure on women coming in, and we talked a little bit about Mrs. Trump coming in. She's going to have a lot of pressure on her to be something that may or may not comport to what she views of herself. And I think we have to remember, Hillary used to say she felt like a Rorschach test for the American public. People would just project onto her, and she was, you know, they were reading signs from her. And it's a tough position to be in.
Okay. Anita, what is it that First Ladies have to do when they first come into office, and then as they sustain 4 years or 8 years, to keep their focus not only on what they want, how do they choose what will then help the administration?
Well, I think first and foremost, and again, let me echo a big thanks for being here. This is just really a lot of fun. I love this topic of First Ladies. This is how I spend my time at American University, as Lauren and Lissa know. And I think to your answer to your question, and First Ladies have to be themselves. And that's how they're going to be most effective when they are representing the country, both at home and abroad. People draw from that sense of credibility and authenticity when they are who they are. And they're best at choosing projects and initiatives to work on that they know something about, that they love, that they can contribute to an overarching goal of the administration, which is really important for them to do. Take what they know, do something with it, of course, but every single one of them, at least that I've had the privilege to meet and get to know and to work with and to study a little bit like Lauren, they're not there for themselves. They are there for the success of their husband's administration. They want the president to be successful. They want to take what they can contribute and make it a part of the overarching goals of the administration.
Well, let me ask you about a specific. I remember I was driving home from the White House one day during the George W. Bush administration, and Scott McClellan was on the phone, on my car phone, saying the First Lady is going tomorrow morning to Afghanistan. It's off the record, but you're on the plane and you have to go. We can't tell a soul. I said,
That's
you
right.
bet I believe I can tell my bureau chief, because I want a camera crew and I want all the equipment I need. And Laura Bush, in a U.S. government plane, flew into Afghanistan. She was the first American official to go in a government plane because she could. How do you decide things like that? Because that was clearly in support of the president, who at that point could
Right.
not physically himself go into a war zone like Afghanistan.
Well, as you know, Ann, I mean, Laura Bush was spoke out about Afghan women in November of 2001, just a month after the liberation of the country, and spoke out about the treatment of Afghan women. So this was something in her heart. She cared deeply about what was happening, and she said to our sisters, half a world away. And it was, her public statements really did help draw support for the president's decision, obviously for lots of reasons, to liberate Afghanistan, but to support women there. She had been very frustrated, though, by not being able to visit the country until 2005, when I came to interview with her to be her chief of staff for the second term. That was the first thing that she said to me, and I'll never forget it. In our interview in the in the residence of the White House, she said, "I want to go to Afghanistan." And that was her, and my first question back to her was, "Does the president know you want to do that?" And she said, because I knew enough from having worked in the White House for you, President Bush, and others, that the assets to do something like that are not going to be available to you unless everybody in the White House, including the president, would agree. And her first response to me was, "Yes, he knows, and he supports that." And with that, I knew, as a new chief of staff coming in, we'd be able to put together that trip, and which we did plan in secret, and I was very grateful that you came and covered it.
And despite the coach seat in the middle, 41 hours there and
It was
back.
a tough trip.
I
It was a
forgive
tough
you.
trip.
Let me ask another specific, and this is Michelle Obama. Lissa, you were at the State Department with Hillary Clinton for much of her time there. And Michelle Obama had welcomed the wife of a foreign leader, had the spouses go off on their little day's adventures while the president and the foreign visitor are meeting. And they went to a school gymnasium, and I remember a child in this inner city school in Washington began to cry and looked up at the First Lady, and she said, "My mother might be deported." And here was the raw example of a First Lady who is welcoming a foreign visitor from Central America, and a child lays out this very vulnerable fear about, will my mother be taken away from me? How do First Ladies cope with what they don't necessarily go out and shop for, but is brought right to their doorstep?
Yeah, I mean, that does happen, and I think they play a very soothing role. And they are, most of them, mothers, for one thing. And I remember, when the Oklahoma City bombings happened.
Right.
And President Clinton gave his radio address, and Hillary Clinton was very prominent in speaking to the nation and calming people's fears and soothing the victims. And they went and visited, and they planted trees and so on. And the presence, I think, of a First Lady and someone who's a mother who had a child at that point who was still living in the White House, I think does send a message that's very, very helpful.
You know, both of these First Ladies we've been talking about, almost all First Ladies coming into the White House have a experience in a state government as a wife of a political candidate. Lauren, Melania Trump will arrive in Washington with basically no government or even spotlight kind of attention. She was very, very limited on where she appeared in the campaign. Is she a blank slate? Does that give her carte blanche to kind of pick what she wants to do?
Well, to some extent, all First Ladies are blank slates because they have full control over what they choose to do, and Melania Trump is just like that. But this is a person who has some attributes that Trump's other family members don't, that Donald Trump himself doesn't. She understands the American immigrant experience to some extent. She learned English. This is a person who speaks many languages. I think it's 5. French and German among them, countries we have really important anti-terror initiatives with right now, and who has been pretty vocal about some projects she wants to work on, which is very early, and that makes me think that there might be something to come.
Well, and does she have the effect of kind of smoothing rough edges when President-elect Trump tends to tweet or say things that rile people? Can she kind of file down those edges and make him a little less of a lightning rod?
That's a good question. We have not really seen a test of this because she was involved so scarcely on the campaign trail. But what I will say, from that last bar graph I showed you, the only way that Melania Trump cannot move opinion of Donald Trump is on the question of relatability. This is, after all, a former high fashion model married to a billionaire, and so I think if there's any area she has not broken through yet with the American public, it's the relatability issue. But just to add something about what Anita was saying about Laura Bush, part of First Lady's powers is their relatability. They are not elected officials. They are not perceived to have entrenched political interest. They are supporting someone they love, which is something most people can relate to.
And is this new, or could we trace this back to the middle of or early 20th century, or to Eleanor Roosevelt?
Yes, we can actually trace it back to the end of the 19th century. We used to have front porch campaigns in this country, and spouses of candidates, Ida McKinley, Frances Cleveland, Carrie Harrison, would have hosted media at their house. And that allowed the campaign a lot of control over these events because they would invite which reporters they wanted to come. But the spouse was a central fixture and really had an opportunity to show the American public life behind the scenes in a presidential campaign.
Well, what about the age of Twitter, though, Lissa? This is different.
This is really different. I think we found that out, and I don't know if, I'm sure many of you watched the 60 Minutes interview last night with Donald Trump, and he basically said, this is my way of getting my message across. It's just effective, and I'm going to keep doing it. He did say he might restrain himself a little bit, but it does take away a lot of other filters, and so it may make the First Lady's role harder if she does have to keep smoothing things down.
It's good or bad, Anita? What do you think?
Well, I think time will tell. I mean, the issue that, as Laura referred to, Mrs. Trump said she might work on already. She said, on cyberbullying and the impact of social media, on young children. So I think that issue can start right at home from the first day, and that would be very helpful. And that's the thing is, it is an automatic, powerful platform. The minute that the president is sworn in, the spouse has this unbelievable platform that they could use for good. But it does take some time to adjust to it. I think for someone like Mrs. Trump, who's only been an American citizen for 10 years, I mean, that is an incredible change to go from being born in a communist country and then coming to the United States. You become an American citizen, and 10 years later, you're the First Lady of the United States. I'm sure that's quite a lot to absorb, and hopefully she'll have a good team around her. I mean, I think the experience of her speech at the convention sort of indicated to me that there weren't enough people there to review that speech and vet it and make sure she was careful. This is when Melania Trump gave a speech that echoed another First Lady's speech? Right, who she admired, and she said, I admired the words of Mrs. Obama and wanted to make it her own. And, it turns out it wasn't, completely written that way for her. So I hope that she follows in the footsteps of the wonderful, women who have been in this role and is successful.
And just to add to that, I think, especially in the age of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, this poor woman is going to be under a microscope like she has never been. And the flaws are magnified, and there's a certain relish, as we all know, in identifying the flaws of people in public life to an extreme nowadays. And she really did retreat, I think, partly because of that speech, most likely. She retreated. She came back out on the campaign at the very end, and really to sort of do exactly what you're talking about, what you've talked about. But she's going to be subjected to a kind of scrutiny that she, I think, has not really been subjected to. And that's hard. She's going to have to be very careful, and she's going to have to, as Anita said, have a terrific staff around her to guide her.
I would love to see Twitter in the hands of somebody like a Barbara Bush. Would you consider Twitter? No, she says no.
No? Why not?
I did cover one First Lady, Betty Ford, who, when she suddenly was moved into the White House, I would travel with her around the country, and she would be out there campaigning all across the country for something called the Equal Rights Amendment, while her husband sitting back in the Oval Office, did not support the Equal Rights Amendment. And Lauren, is that kind of conflict, or not conflict, because he supported her going out and doing that, but that makes it more interesting.
That's rare. I was talking to everyone earlier about how Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, is oversimplified. She was such a groundbreaking first lady, but what many people don't remember is she would not comment on anything she deemed to be in the purview of the president. So she had her own initiatives, she had her own interests, and she made amazing strides with those, but it's very rare for a first lady's projects to be disconnected or unrelated to what the administration is working on. Because what I think White House staff have realized is when everybody is in lockstep, that's when you can make the biggest impact.
What about someone like Nancy Reagan? I recall the day up at the president's ranch when a foreign visitor was there, and President Reagan seemed to be searching for the words to answer a Sam Donaldson question. He was my partner covering the White House, and we all found trouble sometimes finding ways to answer Sam's question. But Mrs. Reagan leaned forward as if looking at her shoes to say, and whispered to President Reagan, "We're doing everything we can."
Yeah.
Well, of
And
course, the
everybody
mic
heard it.
yeah, and it was that great help. It was what's that part of the role like? Where Lissa?
Well, it's obviously that's an important role because they're, and I think Lauren has studied this really brilliantly in her book. These are the last people to have the last word, or they're the closest. They're in the closest proximity to the president. And I do think another thing that does happen, though, we were talking about Betty Ford going out and doing the ERA when President Ford was maybe less inclined to care about that as much. But, you get into these situations also where the First Lady may have a project or an opinion that the president shares, that the senior staff does not share, right? And then you have a First Lady who can become an object of derision or an object of contempt or an object of hostility or nervousness or jealousy or all sorts of other things because that person does have the last word usually with the president of the United States. And so we saw that play out in certain ways in the Clinton White House, especially with the trip to Beijing, which you were on in 1995, the UN Fourth World Conference on Women, where pretty much nobody wanted Hillary to go. And there were a lot of political reasons why it was not a great idea for her to go. And then there were complications with the Chinese with the arrest of Harry Wu. But President Clinton wanted her to go. She wanted to go. We all wanted her to go, and nobody else wanted her to go. And I joke with Mike McCurry a lot about that now because they were trying to tamp it all down. But you get those little rivalries inside the White House as well.
For Anita on a practical level and Lauren on the academic level, do First Ladies get that staff and that support they need?
I think very much they do now, and I have to say there's one First Lady we really have to thank for this, and that is Rosalind Carter. When they came into the White House, she fully expected to work on the issue that she worked on as First Lady of Georgia, and that was mental health. And one of the first decisions that Jimmy Carter made was to establish the Mental Health Commission, wanted Mrs. Carter to run it, to be the chair, and all the roadblocks got thrown up by the White House counsel, by the Office of Legal Counsel, the Department of Justice, because there was no mechanism for the president to have a member of his family or have the First Lady chair something to do a job without compensation. So the way that they had to get around it was by making her honorary chair, which conveyed to her someone who goes and gets involved with photo ops but doesn't get involved with the actual work. So the White House Personnel and Compensation Act of 1978 really is a result of having to look at the office of the First Lady and how you support it, how the staff can function, and actually have resources associated with it. So it's gotten better, since then. For sure, there's a structure in place to have a staff, but they're all considered the staff of the President of the United States assigned to the First Lady. And in my mind, that's perfect way that it should be, because they're not running a shadow government, and they don't want to be a distraction to the president and his work.
Are there good historical examples to support that?
Sure. I think what's so unbelievable to me is that the West Wing and East Wing budgets were not integrated until 1978. So we really do have Rosalind Carter to thank for this. What I've seen in my research is that often on the campaign trail at that stage, there'll be a mistake or a stumble. We remember Michelle Obama's "I'm proud of my country" for the first time remark. That was in February 2008. But after that, what happens generally is spouses are much more substantially staffed. They become more cognizant of their public remarks and want them to be more rehearsed. And so this process of professionalization is happening all through the campaign generally. And it seems to me, even though first-term White House staff are often trusted advisors, people have known for a long time, this process is something that gradually happens. So by the time you arrive in the office of the First Lady, you have a very qualified, professionalized, organized team in place.
I recall, obviously, First Ladies meet their successor. They've met their predecessor. Some are even related to predecessors. But I do remember a wonderful moment. Betty Ford was only First Lady for 2.5 years. And she was interested in everything. And from on the night of the first state dinner for the Carters, things were going to be different. The dinner was going to be held earlier in the evening. There were not going to be cocktails served, just a little wine or sherry or something. There was not going to be dancing because it was a weeknight. And I went upstairs to the event where they allow the press to come up in the afternoon to see the table settings and take pictures of how beautiful the dinner looks before, obviously, the guests all crowd in. And I came back downstairs to the White House press room after viewing the tables. And there was a message please ask me to call the Army Signal Board, which is the military switchboard at the White House. And I called the number, and they said, "Mrs. Ford is trying to reach you." And she said, "Ann, what does it look like? What are they doing? How is it changing?" She obviously didn't feel there was anybody in the White House she could call, so she called the press. I said, "Well, Mrs. Ford, I'll call you tomorrow and tell you all about it," which I did. And she loved hearing about how what she had tended for a couple of years was now handed over to new hands.
Wow.
Is there a special bond between First Ladies that obviously transcends party and politics?
I think so. I think, again, like the President's Club, this is a club of its own, and only they can appreciate the impact on a family life, on a private life, and trying to balance this leading a public life or leading a private life in the bubble and living above the store. So I think that there is certainly a camaraderie amongst that. They understand in a way nobody else can, and I think that visual of the handoff from one First Lady to the next in that meeting in the residence is important. Behind the scenes that they talk about, how will this impact my family's life?
Well, and I'm not sure how many people know that one of the most influential and important contacts that Hillary Clinton had when she first came to the White House was with Mrs. Kennedy. And they became quite good friends, and it was really a friendship built around Mrs. Kennedy advising Hillary on raising kids in the White House and getting lots and lots and lots of advice. And in fact, often when Hillary would go to New York, she would visit with her in her apartment in New York. But they kept quite a friendship going, and they really did not have a friendship before that. So I do think it really makes a difference, as Anita said, to have there are very few people who know what it's like.
Can I add one
Sure.
thing to that? Actually, it was something, Mrs. Bush, that you did for Mrs. Clinton, is to show her the window that's upstairs in the residence in the dressing room area off your bedroom that looks out onto the Rose Garden and into the Oval Office, and you showed that to her. And she did the same thing for Laura Bush when Laura Bush came to the White House. And then Mrs. Bush did the same for Mrs. Obama. She said, "I'm going to do for you what my mother-in-law did for Mrs. Clinton and what Hillary did for me." So I don't know if that took place last week when Mrs. Trump went there, but that was a real connection that I think, a thread that's binding all of them together.
Lauren, so much of what we know about first ladies, including the connection between Hillary Clinton and Jacqueline Kennedy, were from letters, which have been so well preserved. Are those letters still being produced? Not everything's in email, but I'm serious with it. Is there a rich? That was a pun, but you can laugh. But are we in this society now losing some of that history? When you're doing your research, I don't know that many of those letters exist or are being preserved, or at least open to scholars.
Well, Lissa and Anita might be able to expound on this, but the White House Correspondence Office does the bulk of this. And I don't have any particular insight into who prefers letters or who doesn't, but what I can tell you is that when we have that information available to us and we're able to study them and put them all together into a big cumulative picture, we can learn so much, not just about the First Lady behind the scenes and her relationships, but really how they felt about things, what was the actual strategy, what was the actual intention or interest. You really don't know those things unless you find out from the person.
We want very much to hear from you, and we have. We have a fistful of questions from all of you in the audience, and I'm going to, in the few minutes that we're able to do that, we'll try a few of these. This question asks, which First Lady had the most significant effect on the president? Which First Lady had the most significant effect on the country? I'm going to start, Laura, maybe on the country?
I was thinking Lady Bird Johnson. I'm not sure if everyone knows, this was the first Lady to campaign independently of her husband. She actually replaced Jackie Kennedy on the 1960 campaign trail quite a bit since Mrs. Kennedy was pregnant. And she single-handedly went into the South and tried to minimize Republican gains when the Civil Rights Act was passed. And people were very angry about this, but the White House knew she had these Southern roots and she could communicate with people. And actually, she'd even invite cousins sometimes to her campaign events and pick them out in the crowd, and people would realize, oh, she really does know so many people here. So I think that, I really think that was a massive step forward from the campaign standpoint, and I think her influence continued.
And is there an historical or contemporary example of a First Lady who had probably the most influence on her husband?
Well, Edith Wilson, my goodness, who was actually helped run the country, obviously, when President Wilson.
How well was that known at the time, since none of us were around, right?
I don't think very well at all.
I think it was more of not a scandal, but it was a rumor what was really happening. But I think the media apparatus at that time was not so entrenched. People may not have had the access, or they may not have demanded the access that we do and we expect today.
The next question from Metra asks, what is the main role of speechwriters? How much First Ladies contribute, and what factors a writer needs to observe in the process of the speech writing? Speechwriter Lissa Muscatine.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There really have never been speechwriters designated or actually hired for First Ladies until I was hired, and I was not even hired as solely to write for Mrs. Clinton. I was actually hired to write halftime for the president and halftime for her. The idea being that she was taking on health care reform and would need somebody designated for her. And by the way, most presidential speechwriters do not really want to write for First Ladies because they're not speaking as often or on topics that the speechwriters necessarily are interested in, which I think is unfair, by the way. So I was actually hired as the first person, as a presidential speechwriter designated to write for a First Lady, and then we ended up hiring another speechwriter after a couple of years, and I became full-time for Mrs. Clinton, so just so you all know that. And now First Ladies have speechwriters. It really is important to have direct communication with the person you're writing for, whether it's a First Lady, a president, or anybody else. And I was very lucky when I wrote for Mrs. Clinton that I had tremendous access to her. I traveled with her all over the world. I could meet with her anytime. I could reach her anytime. Obviously, the stakes for a first lady are not as high as they are for a president. The president has a lot more things to do typically, so you're not going to have that kind of access unless maybe you're the chief speechwriter to a president. I just want to make note of Mrs. Obama's situation because I'm sure many of you have watched her speeches this year, especially at the Democratic Convention and in the final month of the campaign, where I think she really broke out and did things she never expected she was going to do and just decided she was going to go for it. And she's an extremely powerful speaker. And one of the reasons her speeches, I think, were so tremendously passionate and so authentic to her was because she has had the same speechwriter for pretty much the entire time she's been in the White House, who, by the way, was hired, actually wrote for Hillary in the 2008 campaign, then went to the Obamas, was hired to be a presidential speechwriter for President Obama, and Mrs. Obama asked her to write a speech, and she did, and Mrs. Obama loved her, and that was that. She was now writing for Mrs. Obama, but they have developed this incredible kind of mind meld, can finish each other's sentences, and that is, I think, one of the reasons those speeches have become such tours de force that they've become.
It is a difficult task to have a writer write in somebody else's voice.
Some people can do it, and you find out very quickly if you can't. But it's, people always say to me, oh, could you write for Mrs. Clinton because you're a woman and she's a woman and I'm a little bit younger than her, but roughly the same age. And I really think that's part of it. I think you have certain sensibilities that translate. But I also think it's just the way people think. And you have to know how somebody thinks and makes a case. How do they lay out an argument? How do they lay out an idea in order to really understand their voice? I mean, their voice is partly the rhythms, the cadences, the word choices. Are they colloquial? Are they formal? But it's also actually how their mind puts the argument together.
Next question asks, do you think Michelle Obama has a career in politics, as speculators say? If so, do you think this will be an increasing trend, given the presentation that we've seen tonight on the growing significance of first ladies themselves? I'm going to start with you and then go to the presentation there.
Well, I think she could if she wanted to, but I think there's no chance that she will. I think she never really cared very much about politics to begin with. I mean, getting into this process, she's gotten quite good at it, delivers a great, political speech. She felt the compulsion, and it was compelling for her to do it. But I don't see her doing that. I think that she appreciates and enjoys her private life much too much to have to put it all out there on the public stage all the time.
Are there historical examples of women who might have thought about it, but just it wasn't the right time?
I actually think if we had a way of controlling for the status of women over time, holding everybody constant, since Martha Washington, first ladies would always be pushing the boundaries. Such early first ladies are discredited for lack of political interest, for example, but a lot of this has been the growing status of women in society. So I absolutely think probably some of them thought about that. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, comes to mind as a politician. But I think it's based also on the opportunities available. And I think if Mrs. Obama ran, she would be very, very tough to beat. She is, there's things about Michelle Obama that are generalizable to first ladies, some of these resources I was talking about before, but there's also things that are specific to them. And one of the things Michelle Obama does well is communicate emotion. And that's not something all politicians can do very easily. So I think she's a naturally gifted politician. Not everybody has that.
Hillary Clinton, not to put Lissa on the spot here, but Hillary Clinton did find political life after First Lady. As she was First Lady, she ran her Senate campaign for the state of New York, and then, of course, ran for president not once but twice. Do you think that she now harbors desires to stay in public life, or how do you bring, after living at 60 miles an hour, 65 miles an hour, how do you come to a stop?
Well, I personally, if she asked me right now, I would beg her never to run for office ever again. I mean, it's just, she's been out on the front lines, and frankly, and maybe, I don't know how many people would agree with this, but she's been carrying a lot of water for a lot of people for a long time and taking all the incoming fire. And I'm not saying she's perfect and hasn't made mistakes. Of course she has. But, that's a pretty consuming life to be leading. And she's had some, it's all been under a microscope. So I just would like to see her have a little more of her life back to herself. I can't imagine her running again. I can't imagine her staying terribly involved in the Democratic Party. I think they must recognize that it's time to pass the baton, and there needs to be a new generation of leadership in the party. But I do think she will work. I think she will. There is no doubt in my mind she will do something that has to do with her issues and the cause. If she's worked on them for the last 40 plus years, she's not going to stop now.
Anita, do you think we'll ever have a first lady who keeps her day job, the law office, a medical office? We have Jill Biden, who is has kept up her teaching schedule as a college professor, which has maybe a little more flexibility.
Right.
Could we, or should we, to each of you, should we have a first lady who keeps her professional identity outside of the White House?
Well, first of all, I think it's possible. I think anything's possible. We say in this evolution of the role, and I agree with Lauren. Each occupant that comes into it pushes the boundaries a little bit more and makes it their own. So I think it's possible, but I think having watched it with 3 different wonderful, magnificent first ladies firsthand, where I've had a front row seat, and then watching others after I've left the White House. It's a full-time job to be First Lady of the United States. There's a lot that comes with it. It's not just the ceremonial and the traditional roles, which is very important, but there are issues that you care about, that you want to be involved in. It's travel, it's speeches, it's meeting with people, it's getting out there. It's a really aggressive schedule, and it's hard to do both. I mean, everybody say, coming to having a work-life balance or, a family balance. It's hard. So I think that they may want to do that, and I certainly should try, but may find that something's got to give, as anything in life. Something's got to give.
What do you think, Lissa?
I think it's, again, I really go back to, I think every woman who finds herself in this position has to make a very cold calculation about what works for her. And it's what Anita said at the outset. What is true to her? What does she want? What suits her? What is she comfortable with? And obviously that's going to be factored in with what the president's agenda is. So if it works better for that first lady and her husband, sure. If it doesn't, no. But I think we have to really give first ladies a little more space to make these determinations for themselves and respect their choices. And they're going to be different.
And isn't that what the modern trends has been? Give people choices to do which they want. Right. I want to ask, Lauren, you of this next question that came to us. Seeing the influence of the First Lady and her likability, how might a First Lady progress her career politically and effectively toward a cabinet or presidency? How can she leverage herself without pushback?
Well, she wouldn't be able to have a cabinet position while in the administration. We have the Bobby Kennedy rule where the president cannot preside over a family member or close relation directly. But is this more of a question about political office? If you could, it sounds like something we...
But I think we can expand it beyond that,
okay.
Political or a kind of leadership. Could a First Lady use her experience as leverage to say, hey, look at what I've done?
Absolutely. I mean, this is someone who gets more attention and more average viewers than any elected official. They are just more interesting by nature to people, and we've seen that over and over again. And part of this is the transparency issue. The American public has had growing demands for transparency really since Watergate, and the First Lady has been the primary avenue through which the public can directly access the First Lady. And through social media, First Ladies can communicate directly with the public without going through the traditional media. They can control the narrative. But First Ladies have so many resources after leaving office. The well-known factor and so many people they've worked with. during the administration. I think they can do pretty much whatever they want.
We have time on the clock for one more question, and this is for all three of you. If we had a female president, would the president's husband have the same types of duties and be given the same respect that first ladies have had? Lauren?
Yes and no. During
How's
the
that for a
campaign,
political answer?
during the campaign, we saw the Clinton campaign communicating this very early on. They said, no, he will not be picking flowers, no, he won't be picking China, and no, Chelsea won't either. Hillary Clinton said those are actually things I enjoy doing. But what I was surprised and pleased to see is that Bill Clinton on the campaign trail fulfilled a role spouses have been doing for a very long time. He humanized her. That is what he worked on every day. He talked about how she's had the same friends since grade school. He talked about she is trustworthy, and let me tell you, because I've seen it behind the scenes. So in that way, he's done all of the same things, but we didn't get a chance to see what it would look like in the White House.
Lissa.
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. And I actually had given it quite a bit of thought in the last few months. But, I think it's clear he would not have had a role like she had when she was First Lady to him when he was president. And I think what you do in that situation, and Anita, you would know better than I do, but you have a very, very strong social secretary. Somebody who is taking care of a lot of those details. And even if it were President Clinton, too, who enjoys the flowers and the table settings, she's not going to have time to do that anyway. But you have a strong social secretary who involves you, but keeps you apprised of things. I think he would have played exactly the role you're talking about. I would not have been at all unhappy if she had been elected, first of all, but also had perhaps used him in a diplomatic, an unofficial diplomatic role, or even an official diplomatic role that involved. He's very, very good at bringing people together around the world. He's well known. He has a lot of credibility, and why not use somebody who's that much of an expert?
And she indicated that she would do that, have a portfolio that she would assign to him. At one point, I think it was a domestic issue, maybe on the economy, but very much so, of course. He's well known around the world. It would have been smart to use him that way. And we know First Ladies have been deployed diplomatically as well, so why not the First Gentleman?
But the first gentleman would also be that voice in her ear, the spouse who can rein it in, who can encourage, who can say, come on, you didn't really mean to say that, and who can be that last sounding board of unconditional love, but that voice in the ear of the President of the United States.
In a unique way, because he was President of the United States, too. So he would have even a very different perspective.
Well, and I was just going to say, it's a little bit unfair to think about him as the model for the role, since he comes in with a completely different set of experiences.
Sure.
Now, all sorts of opportunities. This has been such fun to look at the First Lady role and how it is developed through the eyes of actual data and science that have really put a real shape to it. We have a little surprise for you to close this wonderful evening, because we want to talk about one First Lady in particular. Could the screen descend, please? She taught us all the importance and the joy of reading. She used her bully pulpit to make sure we remembered what's important. Holding an AIDS baby at Grandma's house. And next, ringing a bell for the Salvation Army when a local mall tried to kick them out.
Remember that.
Next, reminding the elderly they are not forgotten. She made a lot of friends some of them somewhat famous. Some maybe not so famous, but grateful nonetheless. She always was at the president's side. She had his back, and she had ours. Thank you, Barbara Bush.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. And Anne, Anita, Lissa, Lauren, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. Wonderful evening, very entertaining. We're all going to be thinking about your comments as we see how things play out over the next 6 months or so. So thank you so much. Please join us again very soon for another one of our programs. Thank you again for being with us. And please remain seated for a few minutes while President and Mrs. Bush depart. Good night.